Crises of Humanity, Chapter-8. The increasing gap between the rich and the poor is the root of all evil. The increasing gap between the rich and the poor causes all the evil. The gap between the rich and the poor is the cause of friction in the world economy, both within and between nations, manifesting in the form of terrorism and the current refugee problem. It disrupts human society both in terms of mind and material, and further is the root cause of the degradation of the global environment. If the gap between the rich and the poor causes crime, then such gap itself is a crime. Conflicts and disputes between religions in the modern world have their roots in the gap between the rich and the poor. After the half-century-long economic growth in the free market of the world, the issue of the differences between developed countries and developing countries and the gap between the rich and the poor have now spread into the developed countries, where many of their young generation are forced to become the working poor. Perhaps it could be said that the sad term working poor has been created by affirming greed which the free market has created, or in other words, created by a society based on knowledge and laws which is indifferent to the impoverished and their lives. The young generation will become responsible for payment of the astronomical debt and pension and healthcare payments for the elderly generation. At the same time, they will be forced to deal with a degraded environment and be forced to manage hazardous compounds and nuclear waste created by past generations. 30 years after World War II, as I flew around the world and saw nations where the gap between the rich and the poor is far greater, it struck me Japan has become a comparatively safe country. At that time, the maximum rate of the Japanese progressive income tax was as high as 75%, minimizing the gap between the rich and the poor, and thus resulted in a safe country. People were happy simply by being released from the sufferings of the war. But by lowering the maximum taxation rate in order to benefit the wealthy, Japan has now taken second place in terms of the gap between the rich and the poor among the large GDP nations. Because of the increasing corruption of morals, we now need to worry about the safety of our children commuting to school and the increase of crimes committed for inexplicable and obscure reasons. The adverse effects of the gap between the rich and the poor are the source of most of the problems in human society. As long as a taxation system that favors the rich coexists with a heavy consumption-biased economy, economic disparities will inevitably occur, creating envy and hostility. The non-regular employment system, which was adopted in order to be competitive in the world economy, is the Japanese version of the fixed low wage. The minimum wage in Japan is the lowest among developed nations. It is a pity that the leaders of the nation have adopted this system, which is a far cry from the pursuit of human happiness, guaranteed by the Constitution. Those whose income does not allow the pursuit of human happiness then should not be counted as employed. Won't this be in violation of the Constitution? Many of the working poor are sent to nuclear power plant sites under a non-regular employment status, without knowing the realities of the exposure to radiation. Nuclear power is thus generated at the expense of their health. A society with a large gap between the rich and the poor causes moral corruption, which triggers crime, resulting in security measures, cost increases, or so-called external diseconomies. Due to the increase of this cost, the allocation of funds for happiness and the maintenance and development of society, such as welfare and education, are cut back. As a result, murders and indiscriminate slaughter committed due to widespread hatred are happening. Suspicion and emptiness of heart, and as revenge to the society, are causing suicides. The loneliness caused by the disintegration of human relationships has led to the fading bonds between parent and child, husbands and wives, and smiles are increasingly disappearing from citizens. I took a look at the disparity around the world. According to UN documents, the total GDP of the world is about $70 trillion, and the world's population is about 7 billion people. This makes the annual wage to be an average of $10,000 per person. Furthermore, the document says that about 3.5 billion people, which is half of the world's population, is living on $2 or less a day. That's about $700 a year, even you work without a day off throughout the year. $2.5 trillion seemed like such a small amount for 3.5 billion people. I did the math many times, but it is not $25 trillion. It is only $2.5 trillion. The remaining 3.5 billion people get the remaining 95% of the $70 trillion. No wonder satisfying conclusions cannot be reached at those peace meetings. It is hopeless to achieve world peace with such disparities unsolved. In this half-century, the gap between the rich and the poor has widened to make one wonder if we have become bereft of intelligence. And the gap is steadily widening along with the rapid growth of the world economy and the growing world population. The grudge against the rich felt by the poor facing food shortages and who are forced to work at cheap wages instigates the creation of hotbeds of terrorist organizations and is one of the destabilizing factors in the Middle East and a hindrance to world peace. The large gap between the rich and the poor causes other problems. Food, when moved about, tends to be accumulated in the wealthy countries. The multilateral distribution system allows for the development of farmlands and crop production in low-cost countries with cheap wages, which are then exported to countries who are willing to buy at a higher price than the producing countries. This is the origin of the North-South divide. There is another tragedy from this distribution structure. If the food exported is a surplus product, this is not an issue. But the reality is that even countries whose population suffers from hunger export their food products to those who will buy them at a higher price. Even as we look at the food distribution alone, food flows to places where there is money. Hunger exists not because there is not enough food, but because people do not have the money to buy food. The reason for the lack of money is not because these people are not working, but because they cannot get any wage increase, earning only $1 or $2 a day. The big reason for not getting any wage increase is because they are working for the people of other countries. Far since the days of colonialism, there are still many countries that get away with paying low wages, and therefore the wage rates are on a downward trend. These food products will go to consumers of wealthy countries, but such consumers do not know the faces of the low-wage workers, their working conditions, or the practices, so far from their own, of these poor countries. They are simply looking for lower-priced products. Therefore, even as the world economy grows, the situation of low wages is not resolved, and the poverty becomes a permanent reality. As an international person, it is important that you not only have the skill to learn a foreign language and be a successful trader, but also have a sense of moral bond with people around the world. Solidarity in life is the fundamental for living together. I think we should regard any person's life as precious as our own and work based on this concept, wishing happiness for everybody. I want people to feel a moral bond to everyone throughout the world. The monetary bond will not last long and will not produce peace and joy. In my view, as one who has had many opportunities to fly between the rich and poor countries, what looked funny was that in these countries with large gaps between the rich and the poor was that the rich lived together in quarters, surrounded by high walls, guarded by an armed private force, as if they were in a prison. But life outside the prison wall seemed far from quiet life. I just wanted to turn my eyes away from those people and their lifestyle. The situation was more than sarcastic, and nothing other than an irony. Even though some may dismiss it as a fantasy, if you really wish for the happiness of future generations, there are no solutions other than transforming the economic structure, including a fair tax system, reflecting the concept of sharing, which is common sense for human beings. Despite life being universal, the fact that a difference exists between the rich and the poor is a mortal sin of human intelligence, and including the destruction of the environment, these are nothing but the root of all evil of human society. The gap between the rich and the poor and the global environment. Can the developed countries be a model for the developing countries? The gap between the rich and the poor is related to the destruction of the global environment. The poor countries have to export natural resources, agricultural products, and labor to the rich countries at a low cost, at the expense of devastating their own environment in order to obtain foreign currencies. And these exported goods increase consumption and pollution in the rich countries. There are many people who have no choice but to destroy the environment for living, while there are too many rich people who by choice do damage to the environment by developing timberland, converting them into buildings, and whipping up the desire for consumption by lining up cars and commodities. There is a close chain reaction-like relationship between the gap between the rich and the poor, peace, and the environment. If we want peace and the recovery to a beautiful global environment, reducing the gap between the rich and the poor has to be top priority. I am very reluctant to say this, but it seems to me that the slowdown of economic growth in the rich countries, along with the deterioration of the global environment, is causing the rich countries to invest in low-wage countries, and in the name of democratization, grow their economy by whipping up greed and converting this to the power of their own economic growth. As a result, the least desirable thing is the triggering the gap between the rich and the poor. This will cause envy and devastation of morals. The gap between the rich and the poor is accompanied by the devastation of the environment. What if we start the production in the countries where the natural resources and labor are at a low cost? As you can see on the television screen, huge buildings and large factories are lined up. Cars and motorcycles are overflowing on the road, and water pollution and destruction of the forest are everywhere. One can only imagine that the heavy air pollution is causing the widespread presence of hazardous compounds. The gap between the rich and the poor is widening, and I hear stories that nuclear power plants are being sold to countries where even primary education is not sufficient. Isn't this an act that is neither for economic growth nor for happiness of the people, but to exhaust the land and humanity of the other nation? Can't it be said that such a framework is putting pressure on the environment of the developing nations and allowing developed nations to earn profit and protect their environment, expanding the gap between the rich and the poor? There is a worrisome tone of argument about what would happen to the global environment if the consumption of the developing nations reaches the same level as the developed nations. On the other hand, large companies are investing in the developing nations, such as to inspire greed, thus widening the gap between the rich and the poor and causing moral destruction. My question is, why do we end up with such results when there are supposedly many kind and intellectual people in at-large companies? Companies are structured to maximize profit to the extent that it does not violate the law, a system that goes against common sense. Prime examples are selling weapons and nuclear power generation to the poorest of nations. As long as there are no laws against it, organization behaviors are motivated by profits, overriding the kindness and sense of responsibility of people, even if it results in residual contamination and widening the unfairness, exhausting the resources of partner nations. I think this is more a problem of the inadequate law or what the Constitution tells the nation to be, rather than an issue of the corporate mentality or the minds of the people. In Japan, even though there is a law that prohibits the export of weaponry parts, a loophole in the law allows deadly weapons to be exported in the form of nuclear power generators, which can be considered to such. If we want happiness and prosperity for developing nations, we should not be pursuing short-term profits, but making our priority investments in welfare and education in those countries, paying attention to fostering real democracy and not widen the gap between the rich and the poor. The result should be a society filled with calmness, fairness, and happiness, which will reduce religious conflicts and lead to a peaceful nation. There will be beautiful countrysides and smiles in people's hearts. Although developed nations are considered materially wealthy, only a limited portion of the population is wealthy, and the rest are in a tough spot. Many become prisoners due to the gap between the rich and the poor. Food is excessively wasted, and there are no smiles on the face of the people on the street. If they only know the reality of wealthy nations, people who live in quiet countries will not feel like following the model of the developed nations. Economic disparities between nations in the world create hotbeds of the terrorism. Domestic disparity in the society causes civil war. Every day we see on the television that weapons are sold to both sides, destroying the life environment. The conclusion of the modernization era between the great powers left nations vying for natural resources, and with it the sequelae of ethnic domination and colonization, and a gap between the rich and the poor in the resulting troubled independence. And as a result, global environment also deteriorated. When the Eastern Bloc nations began to adopt the free market economy, it was expected that they would become gentle and equally rich nations with little gap between the rich and the poor. But instead, they have only taken on the detrimental features of the free market economy, further widening the gap between the rich and the poor, and exhausting rural areas by heavily polluting the environment. This may become a major obstacle in dealing with the continuing crisis of global environment deterioration in the future, just when the global cooperation is needed. The scenario is similar to the era when Japan, which during the process of modernization, departed from the cultural idea of circulation philosophy, and became unable to control the military sector. Although it is commonly said during the discussion of disarmament, weapons are a waste if not used, but once used, they will destroy the social structure, and both sides become impoverished. The outcome, if any, will only amplify hostility between each other. The problem is that even if the weapons are not used, weapons are continually being upgraded to be expensive and high-powered for the sake of the growth of the munitions industry during the time of peace, exhausting the nation's funds, which could otherwise be used for the happiness of the nation. Such weapons, expensive to maintain and useless if it is not used, but would destroy the whole world if used, is precisely what is termed external diseconomies. If we are intelligent enough and take an opposite view, we could create harmonious life with censors, sanctions, and sensitive diplomatic responses, instead of spending trillions of dollars in military expenditures on civil wars of other countries. And if this military expense could be used for the purpose of those countries' welfare instead, hostilities would turn into friendship, narrowing the gap between the rich and the poor, and then the world will naturally tend toward peace. Instead of wasting trillions of dollars and many human lives and use these for environmental programs and peaceful diplomacy, then I think it will not be too late to recover a peaceful and beautiful world. The principle of material ownership and happiness. There is a simple principle about possession of goods and happiness. If there is no difference between the rich and the poor among us, we can be in peace in body and soul. Also, we can be kind to the others. If we are unhappy because we don't have the material goods, that would mean people in the ancient days who did not have any of the convenient things we have today were not happy at all. Whether we have material goods or not is not a factor that determines happiness. If only you or certain people are in possession of such goods, then everyone becomes unhappy because the situation causes envy and conflicts. Regardless of whether a nation is wealthy or not, if there is a small gap between the rich and the poor, then such a nation would be calm at journey's end. Smiles and kindness are the best hospitality for a traveler. It was precisely so for me in my 80-some years of journeys. The pleasure meeting kind-hearted people. Although I have had many opportunities to visit countries where there were large gaps between the rich and the poor, I never felt comfortable in such places. Seeing the poverty outside my modern hotel made me depressed by the fact that I was part of the society symbolized by the hotel. Whether I flew to these countries as an airline pilot or for mountain climbing, such experiences touched my heart. I've compared the reality and my life. It is all about the standard of if I am materially wealthy or not. Thus the idea came to mind to calculate by dividing the GDP of the world by the world's population. The resulting GDP per capita, in which I included babies to elderly people, was about $10,000. This is about 1 million yen per capita per year, give or take some change in the exchange rate. At this standard of living, my wife and I would make 2 million yen per year. Whatever I actually make is then embarrassingly luxurious. According to a UN document, more than half of the world population is living on less than $2 a day. Thinking about these people makes me, having little time left to live, uncomfortable. Another thing about material goods and happiness is that it seems that once people have certain amount of material goods and money, their happiness level does not increase proportionate to the increase of such material goods and money. Up to the point until you obtain what is necessary to live, satisfaction increases. But at a certain level, satisfaction starts to decrease. There must be an intersection where the decrease in satisfaction meets the increase in material goods, similar to the feeling of fullness after meal. This is not just my thought processes. When I looked into the UN documents, I think I found that the intersection was around $14,000 per capita annually. This is a very interesting figure when you think about the level of desire, luxury, and happiness of the human. During my 80 years of life, I have met happy people, but they didn't seem to be happy because they had money and goods. I have also seen many wealthy people who always had sour expressions on their faces. Having said this, I think we can say that, beyond a certain point, wealth in terms of money and goods has nothing to do with wealthy of the heart. I have also imagined how I will change if I get more money, power, and a higher social status. Will I become more suspicious? The thing I fear the most, what I think is the unhappiest of all situations, is loneliness. The fear of being lonely may increase as you have more property and desire for power. In the end, it seems that once you acquire a certain level of goods, your time starts to become occupied with managing such goods, and your mind becomes engrossed with showing off your property with a sense of superiority which makes your mind impoverished. I believe that unless you become abject, it would be better to be poor so that you won't need to spend time thinking about your goods and money, and instead use the time to think about other lives and become spiritually rich in that way. But in actuality, not getting enough even you work hard will make your heart poor and lonely, just as if you have too much. It seems to be that having too much or too less makes the mind impoverished. I think this is also consistent with the teaching of the old sages. Presently, the world is busy being chased by the illusion of the so-called time thief. Japanese character, busy, is the character, mind, and loss together, as in losing one's mind. The character implies that the mind of both the rich and the poor will become impoverished if they become too busy. I feel sorry for those busy people who lead the world, but at the same time, it worries me. I want the leaders of the nations to be people that put solidarity of life as a priority. Urban life is driven by money, and without money you cannot live unless you steal from someone else. There is no choice but to repeat this, even you come out of the prison. For the poor, lack of money is a matter of life or death. What do you choose to buy something? Maybe you are buying it because an advertisement perked your desire despite not feeling the need for it. In modern society, there is an increasing number of adults who stir up a child's desire to buy unnecessary things and don't care one bit about it. Under such circumstances, children grow up believing that rather than creating human bonds, the possession of goods will make them happy. Thus, their minds become corrupt. They may become the ones to lead society or nation, and yet not have the sympathy to consider human lives. Rarely are those goods that you bought due from the enticement of advertisements turn out to be necessary. Many of them are not easy to use, and you end up putting them in the closet, putting them out of sight, out of mind. The junk then gets in the way when you look in the closet for something you really need, and yet you hesitate to throw it away out of a feeling of wasting something. All the more if they are trinkets bought on a trip that bring back even a little bit of memory. It is the same sentiment you feel when you find broken toys and dolls or children's clothing left behind in the closet by your grown-up children or grandchildren. It is my ideal to leave nothing behind after my death, but time is running out as I postpone throwing away these things. The same can be said for my monetary assets, however small. It is not necessary that I hand the assets over directly to needy whose annual income is less than 1 million yen, so long as it gets distributed through the tax system that distributes them as welfare. Perhaps this is unsolicited interference, But I think people who have a lot of assets that didn't get consumed during their lifetime will have a lot of trouble when they depart. As my own departure comes close, I'm starting to think about many things which I didn't think of before. Similar to an uncluttered Japanese alcove, I believe people are happier with less things around them. I am confident that happiness does not arise out of a materially satisfied civilization. My feelings for the gap between the rich and the poor. One cannot choose to be born. There would be nothing more splendid a world if we can share happiness by working together, wherever we are and regardless of our individual capabilities. Such thoughts come to mind when I think about the gap between the rich and the poor, about the global environment, and about all the troubles in the world. My first overseas experience was when I was invited to the All India Tennis Championship in Kolkata as a student. And at that time, I saw tremendous wealth and tremendous poverty. I remember finding people laying cold outside on the street out of my hotel in the morning. After becoming an airline pilot, I had many chances to fly to those poor nations, where I was always struck by the illogical fact that I was born who I was. I did not choose to be born. I could have been born as a dirt poor, a person that is hated, some other creature other than a human, or even a non-life substance, such as inorganic molecule. All of us are born and given life by sheer chance. It goes the same for talent. Some are born with superior talents, some with excellent understanding, some with outstanding organizational skills, some with good memory, and others with high IQ. I want people, to whatever their talent, to be used towards the happiness of all mankind and creatures. These precious lives and talents are given by chance, should not be your only. The wealth earned with your talent should be used to wish and bring happiness to as many lives as possible. How nice it would be if my country, Japan, can be in the forefront to be an example of such a nation. It would make me be happy that I was born in Japan. I think we can accomplish this by making changes to the Constitution, which includes a provision stating the importance of life, as well as rethinking the taxation system. I sometimes fantasize that I have great ability, then I can live a joyful life by making many people happy. It's only a fantasy and never came true. But fantasy aside, I would like as many lives as possible happy to the utmost of my ability. I wish I had known about the blue little bird, which I have found now, that expresses how making others happy makes oneself happy in my younger days. Let's look at this from another point of view. What if you spend the wealth you earned with your talent only for yourself or a specific organization? Excellent talents, intelligence, and passions, which are not found on human bounds, then become a dangerous weapon. That person with extraordinary ability then becomes associated with selfish desire for vanity, power, honor, and money. Although to different degree, everyone has some vanity, and vanity, which is tied to all sorts of selfishness, is a difficult thing to deal with. I spent a lot of time and energy to try to get rid of it all my life, but still, I am still short of my goal. I believe that those who were in a position to lead the world must have had great talent, but the world is not taking any action and fighting each other to a breaking point when the life on earth is in danger. A certain book on psychology contends that people and existence surrounding a vain person are to satisfy his or her vanity. This brought a chill to my mind. I want those people to use their talents not as a weapon, but to hand over the beautiful earth to the next generation. End of Chapter 8.